This is the Motivated Business Show, hosted by me, Mark Terrell, the author of Motivated, the Reluctant Leader's Guide to Building a Business that Sets You Free. In my book, I share the 7-step process to get the measure of your business. M.E.A.S.U.R.E is an acronym that stands for Mirror, Evaluate, Action, Systemize, Unify, Review, and Energize. On each episode, I'll be chatting to a business owner about how they stay motivated and how they've got the measure of their business. So without further ado, let's find out who's joining me on this episode. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Motivated Business Show with me, Mark Terrell. And today's guest I met a few weeks ago. I was talking at an event, an expo, and Trevor had a stand. And I sat down and I recorded part of his podcast for him. And so it seemed the natural thing for him to join me on my podcast. So here we are. This is the day that we've got in the diary. And we are going to be talking about the P's. And no, my guest is not Bob Holdness. He is not that person that hosted Blockbusters. But we're going to be talking about a lot of P's today. So two being presenting and podcasting. But there we go. We will get into that very shortly. But before we do that, let's just remind you of a few things. Firstly, my book. Reason I tell you about it is I'd like you to buy a copy if you haven't got one, obviously. And you can buy that either from myself, directly from my website, or you can buy it from Amazon in paper or Kindle form. And if you'd like to also just keep the podcast wheels in motion, then you can buy me a coffee. And by clicking on the QR code, you go straight there and buy me a coffee, and any donations are well received and appreciated. But if you buy me 2 coffees, I will send you a copy of my book. So there we are. Hopefully that's an offer you can't refuse. But with that out of the way, now let's bring on today's guest. Welcome, Trevor.
Hello, Mark. Great to see you. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. Let's give you an opportunity to introduce yourself properly first, though.
Okay, well, that's great. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, absolutely. As you said, we met at the Filton Business Expo, and you came on my podcast. So my quick 30 seconds is that I did a sports degree 100 years ago. I got a job. I wanted to be a sports journalist, and I spent 29 years in the local media sector and completely failed in my ambition to be a sports journalist. So there you go, 29 years of complete failure. I did end up being the regional managing director and managing, massive teams and huge turnovers, but never made it as a sports journalist. So there's still time. And then a dozen years ago, the company that I worked for, which was part of the Daily Mail group, decided to offload their regional arm, which was probably good timing given the state of local newspapers today. And I set up my own consultancy, and now I specialize in helping business people with their presentation skills, their sales pitches, their public speaking, and indeed their day-to-day sales interactions.
Brilliant. There's a potted history of Trevor's, how he got to be doing what he's doing. So that's really interesting. We might delve a bit more into that as we have our conversation, Trevor. But let's firstly start. We're talking mainly about presenting today, but we might sort of meander over to podcasting at some point. Because presenting is the thing that you just said that you help people with. And what I want to talk about first of all is the thing that holds people back. And I think one of the things that definitely held me back in the early days was confidence, wondering whether I had the confidence to do it. But sometimes you just got to get on and try it, don't you? So how does that sort of work for most people when they have to do a presentation in maybe in their company or in a networking setup?
Well, you're absolutely right, Mark. I know loads and loads of business people, and if you meet them on a day-to-day basis, they come across as being quite confident, they know their stuff. And then you say to them, hey, what about doing a presentation? And they run a mile.
Right.
And it's a strange one, really, isn't it? Because, they know their stuff. They're good people because that's what their job is all about. Yet the thought of standing up potentially, or, in these days it could be virtual as well, of course, and doing that presentation. And one of the things I always say to them if they're really lacking, that confidence to do it is, I say, if you don't present, you're letting those people down who would have been listening to you. because they're never going to get an opportunity, to understand what you've got to share and benefit from it. So it's not about you. It's about you letting them down by not presenting.
Right.
So that's one of the tacks I take, and to see whether that can convince them that, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that, kind of thing. But it is a big thing, that confidence. I think the other thing I notice when I work with people is that usually it's the 10 minutes before you start that is the real big problem area. People just get themselves in a right lather, and once they get going, they're fine. And usually what happens is they enjoy it so much, then they slip into that thing where we all try and avoid when we're presenting, which is running over on time, because they think, oh, this is great, I didn't know I could do this.
Yeah. It's interesting, because I think flicking through your book, and Trevor has written a book all about successful presenting. The number one P, and there's a 7P process in the book, so we won't be going through all 7 steps today. The number one is purpose, the reason why you're doing it. I guess that's where we should always start, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I've been in audiences, and people have done presentations, and they've spotted me, and they'll come up to me and say, "How did I do? How did I do?" And I'll say, well, what was the purpose of your presentation? And they look at me kind of blankly, as though, what? What do you mean? And I say, well, your purpose is, why are you presenting? What do you want the outcome to be? And to a degree, what do you want the next steps to be? And until you know those 3 things, how on earth can you think about what you're going to present? And of course, this is where people get it largely wrong, because they think, oh, I just where was the last presentation we did? Oh, I'll just change the front slide and off we go. But if you've got that purpose focus, because all the way through those 7 steps, it's going back to that purpose, which is why it's number one. Establish that, and it makes such a big difference.
Yeah, I read a book back in the day called The Jelly Effect, and it really brought it home to me, because it's the jelly effect. They talk about just throwing information, as if you throw jelly at a window, then the odd bit might stick, but most of it won't. So if you want the jelly to stick, then you've got to understand who you're talking to, the reason why you're talking to them, and also you want to know what the outcome is that you want to get at the end, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the jelly effect I call the kitchen sink effect, where people think, oh, yeah, I need to tell them this. Oh, I need to tell them that. Oh, and this. Oh, and don't forget, I must mention this. And most of that is irrelevant to what the audience are there for. But as the presenter, you feel as though I've got to tell them, because it means they'll know how good I am.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I suppose then that brings us on to another topic, really, then. It's about sort of taking it seriously, isn't it? And realising that you have a serious thing to do if you're in front of people, taking that time seriously for the opportunity, firstly, and not wasting the people's time that are listening to you as well.
Well, I think you're right, because if you think about it, Mark, and people listening to this, you've got a chance to do a presentation, whether it's your 1-minute elevator pitch at a networking event, but there are going to be 10, 20, 30, 40 people, maybe more. And in theory, you've got their attention for whilst you're speaking. So, if they all turned up in your office right now, 40 people crammed into your office and said, oh, we've come to listen to you for 20 minutes. Wow, well, okay. And that's why, I think a lot of presentations, they tend to be wasted. I call them golden opportunities. So just don't waste it. And that means you've got to put the time in to prepare, and you've got to put the time into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got to actually breach the topic of the dreaded slides, or the death by PowerPoint, which is a lot of people talk about. So what was the biggest mistake people make when they introduce slides, do you see?
Well, I think that it's the words, Mark. How many times have you sat there with a slide with tons of words on? And listen, if you put a slide up with lots of words on, you think about the audience. So what are you doing? What's happening then? Are you saying to the audience, you need to read all these words? That's why I've put them there. Otherwise, why put them there?
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the danger as a presenter, you start reading them. So the audience are thinking, do I read them? Do I listen to you reading them? They don't, it's all over the place. And we fall into that trap so many times. I am on a mission to rid the world of PowerPoint slides, if you're delivering it live. Now, if you're sending someone a presentation for them to go through, that's a kind of different kettle of fish. But when I work with people, when I do webinars or training programs or whatever it is, I have this little quiz, and they usually end up winning. I usually offer a copy of the book that you kindly mentioned earlier, and I say, how many slides have I used so far? And I did this when I spoke at the Bournemouth version of the conference that we met at, and people going, 17, 22. Well, somebody said 9, I think.
Okay.
Someone was bold and said 31, and the answer was something like 78.
Wow.
And people are astonished, and they say, 78 slides? I've only been speaking for 16 minutes. The point being is that it's not the number of slides that cause death by PowerPoint. It's what you put on each individual slide. You put up a slide with lots of words, lots of complex diagrams, people go, oh my God. So the rule is, and I kind of invented this myself, so I think it's a prompt. It's not a script. A prompt, not a script. And if you can work on that basis, but people find it, most of the people who start working with me on a key presentation or sales pitch, the first thing is, I've got to persuade them to get rid of the words. And that's a tough gig for them. Often because the presentation's not being created by them, but somebody in a marketing department who's got no idea, ultimately, how to, deliver a key presentation.
Excellent. Yeah, and absolutely agree. It's one of the biggest learnings I've had. When I first started out, I was anxious about all the things and putting every bit of information on those slides. But now, like you say, I keep it to a minimum and also use an image as a prompt rather than the actual words I'm going to say. Because otherwise, like you say, there's what's the point? You might as well just
or even get rid of the slides, Mark. Get rid of them.
Okay.
Can't really. I should have got it prepared to show you on screen, but I've got an old suitcase, and I call it the 1970s PowerPoint.
Right.
And I do some gigs where I just don't use slides. I just pull things out this suitcase, props. And of course, people still talk about it. I've got this one where I do a wetsuit T-shirt analogy about how is it easy to buy from your company, and people say to me years later, "Oh, I remember the wetsuit thing, Trevor." They don't remember my slides.
Well, that's a lesson in point, isn't it? It's not the words; it's the actions it's how people you make people feel that matters, isn't it? So if they're inspired in some way, they're more likely to remember and also maybe take some action as well. Yeah,
absolutely, definitely, without doubt. And so again, the P of PowerPoint is number 5 in my circle of 7. Because most people do it number 1. As I mentioned, they fire up the PowerPoint, see what they did last time, change the front slide to your company, not the previous company, and think, oh, great, I'm ready.
Yeah. But don't you think that's because most people don't really want to do it? And with regards to motivation, when you've got a reason to do something, then you're more likely to find a way. And most people may be also thrown in to do a presentation last minute, no real time to prepare, and then of course they're sort of thrown under the bus a little bit. Is that something you come across a lot?
Absolutely, that does happen. I remember going to a conference because one of the things about presenting, I always say to people, collect the anecdotes, the stories that you've seen. And I always say to people, if you want to learn how to be a better presenter, sit in an audience, someone's presenting, you become the coach. So when they come to you afterwards and say, Trevor, what could you coach me on with my presentation for next time? You would tell them. But yeah, I think you think you're right. People who we've all have heard people who stand up in front of an audience and say, "Oh, I'm sorry about this, but I was only told I was doing this last night."
Yeah.
You're kind of thinking, okay, so what you're really saying is this is going to be rubbish.
Yeah.
And I've already made my excuse for why.
Yeah, because the first thing you're going to do is say, why are you telling me this? Oh, I know why, because it's not going to be very good. So just to prepare. Yeah, exactly. So let's go back to the positives with regards to presentation and the opportunities that give you. So I cannot believe the amount of people that I meet in networking situations who have never stood and done a presentation to their networking group because they don't see the point, or they just don't want to do it for some reason. Because I see it as, when you talk about opportunities, especially when you're networking, if you can stand up and get a 20-minute slot in front of everybody, that is a golden opportunity if there is one.
It's a brilliant way to start because, presenting in front of your colleagues can be a bit daunting. Mm-hmm. But presenting at a networking event where, smaller the better in a sense, so you might get 5 or 10 minutes, And usually a lot of the small networking events don't worry about equipment. They may not be geared up for it. You might be meeting in a cafe or something like that. So again, it's a great way of presenting when you get going, not using slides. Because you've got, you don't have to worry about the equipment, the slides, the size of the screen, all that sort of stuff. So my advice would be, if you're reluctant to present, find a presentation opportunity, and it could be outside of work as well. It could be like to a community group, or the club that you represent, or whatever it might be. 5-10 minutes, no slides, and talk about something you know well.
Yeah, and also, I suppose, just talk about the barriers. Personality is another thing, isn't it? So most people would assume that extroverts are more inclined to be good presenters, and introverts maybe not so much. So what's your view on that?
Well, that's a great point, because it's in one of my programs. I talk exactly about that, because people think you're right. People think, oh, you've got to be an extrovert to be a great presenter. You haven't. When I first started presenting, I was not an extrovert. People might think I'm a little bit now. The problem, Mark, with extroverts when they present is they're usually overconfident. So they do a lack of preparation. They do a lack of practice. They usually massively run over on time because they're just so full of themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas an introvert tends to be more precise. They tend to take practice seriously. They get the timing right. They do the preparation. And I just say to people, you're not trying to win an Oscar. If you've got a 20-minute presentation, you've got to be your authentic self, but just be the best of you for that 20 minutes. And remember, show some passion for your subject, because you know it really well. Presumably you like your subject. So just do those things and you'll come across really well. You don't want to be, oh, hey, look at me, hey, this is going to be great, and as extroverts can sometimes, create that perception.
Yeah. So introverts have a power it's a different power to the extroverts, but they can do it just as well. That's basically what you're saying, yeah?
I think sometimes they can do a lot better, frankly.
Right. There we
A
go.
lot better. Yeah.
Good stuff. So I think it's an interesting one, because, as you say, extroverts are more willing, but that doesn't mean they're going to do it better, does it? Whereas I suppose if an introvert is a little bit less willing to do the actual presenting for the sake of it, then they might actually do more preparation and realise it's not about me, it's about the audience. And that's always the thing, isn't it? Remembering what the audience wants and making sure that they get some value from this, and it's not just me just throwing, as I said at the beginning, jelly at me.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest challenges in my world as a presentation coach are CEOs who've been around the business scene for a long time. They've been presenting, talking to people, for a long time, and they just think they're great. And usually they're not. And it's because they just think, well, because I'm confident about standing up in front of people, I can be a great presenter. So they never actually consider that there is a skill to presenting. They just think, because I'm comfortable standing up in front of people, because I've been doing it my whole career, I must be a great presenter. And they're not. So when businesses are presenting as a team, like for a big investor pitch or something like that, I say to them, so who's your best presenter? Who's your number one presenter? And let me put a caveat. I don't think it'll be your CEO or your chief financial officer. And then they think, oh, how? What do you it could be a junior member of your team. But if they're the best presenter, it's like, who's your best centre forward? Who's going to score the goals for you?
Yeah. It's that cringeworthy, I don't know whether you watch The Apprentice, when they have to present their ideas. and you just know it's just going to be cringeworthy, because most of them wouldn't have prepared and they don't know their audience and actually the things to say. But going back to the CEO or the head of the company not being the best person, I think one of the reasons might be because that person never probably gets the feedback they need to actually improve. That no one's is brave enough to tell them, isn't it?
Well, I was involved in a conference just before COVID, and I was there to do some, presentation network just after lunch. And in the morning, there were 3 or 4 people from the organisation. It was an association of people doing presentations. And the host, every time someone stood up, the host said, "Oh, that was brilliant, Elizabeth. That was brilliant, Frank," and all that. And I'm thinking, oh my God, and the audience are now being told that all these presentations are brilliant. And I didn't think I think they were good, but they weren't brilliant. And I think that's the same thing. You know, you get your CEO doing a presentation, everyone's going to say, "Oh, that was brilliant, Mark. That was brilliant." You know. So I wrote this thing called "Never Ever Tell Me My Presentation Was Brilliant."
What would you tell them to do otherwise? What's the opposite?
I think however experienced you are, however many presentations you've done, you'll always pick up something. Somebody came on my podcast, and I can't remember who it was, and said, every time you do a sales pitch, a presentation, a sales interaction, just step back and say, right, if you could do that again, now you know what's happened, what would you do differently?
Yeah.
So what could you do better next time? And you can always do. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing this stuff. There's always something that could be better next time.
Yeah. So I've started to introduce more questions into my presenting.
Okay.
So is that something that you teach? Is it something that it's a good thing to do? It seemed to work for me.
I think it depends on the presentation. I mean, if you've got 10 minutes and you start bringing in questions early on, then there's a chance, 2 minutes in, that somebody could ask a question. So you've got to be careful how you bring them in. But definitely, audience interaction is a big thing, particularly if you're presenting virtually. You've got to keep them involved, either through polls or live questions or whatever it is. One of my top tips for a Q&A, by the way, because a lot of presentations and pitches have Q&As, is don't wait to the very end to do your Q&A. A lot of people say, right, thanks very much. Now, any questions? And then it can fall really flat because there might not be any questions, or there might be some terrible ones. So 2 tips. Number 1, have a couple of questions up your sleeve, like you obviously have, so you can ask the audience. And the second thing is, do the Q&A just before your final summary. So then when the Q&A is finished, say, right, I'm just now going to sum up what I've said, so you can re-energize the audience if it's lost its energy during the Q&A, which often happens. But questions are a good thing. You've got to get the timing and the occasion right then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. 10-minute ones don't work, like you say. Right. You meant another P word, which I sort of at the beginning of the podcast mentioned that we might go down that rabbit hole, but podcasting. We're on a podcast now. And you told me, actually, just before we went live, is that my previous guest, the previous episode, was with Chris M.E.A.S.U.R.E, and he was pivotal in you getting into podcaster. Do you want to tell that story?
Well, I latched onto podcasting. I've been working on my own for 12 years, so I think I remember listening to podcasts before that. Anyway, I got into Chris M.E.A.S.U.R.E and Marcus Sheridan and Robert Polizzi and Robert Rose, Joe Polizzi and Robert Rose, and all those sort of guys. And I was, doing a bit of marketing stuff at the time. And I remember listening to an episode of Chris, and he had this guy on called Pete Matthew, and Pete said he was from Penzance in Cornwall, which is where I'm based. And Pete's a financial wealth, man, a personal finance guy. And so I contacted Pete, and I said, I've been thinking about doing a podcast. I heard you on the Chris M.E.A.S.U.R.E show, and I've looked up your podcast, and he's been doing it for a while. And Pete was brilliant. He met me face to face, gave me an hour and a half of his time, told me absolutely everything I needed to do to be a podcaster. And then, a bit like being a confident presenter, it took me almost a year to build up the confidence to actually do it and press the go button and follow his advice. And so I am grateful, not only for the coincidence with Chris, but then what led to Pete and Pete's time. And I still see Pete on a fairly regular basis, and he's kind of been my podcast mentor. So yeah, been great. He's been great.
Brilliant. So my next question is, why podcasting? Why do you do it, and what's the benefits?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it, Mark? I mean, you're clearly in this sector as well. I think what happened was I got started, and then I remember after 7 or 8 episodes, it was called Attracting and Retaining Customers, my first podcast. And I've had 3 different titles. It's now Better Presentations, More Sales. And Pete said to me, if you're going to be serious about this, you've got to be out on a regular basis. And it just kind of took off. And I've done over 300 episodes of that now. I've got a running podcast, which I started the running podcast to help me run that. You might see the classic quarter shirt behind me. I did that as a 60th birthday thing, 44, 5 miles as an ultra marathon, which I'd never been anywhere near like that before. So I launched the podcast, and I've got an unnecessarily elevated position in the running community because of my running podcast, which is, 100 40 odd episodes, and now I've started a cricket one as well. So I just love it really, and I love the medium, and I suppose it's the radio frustrated radio TV guy in my system that's coming out.
Right. Yeah. No, I resonate with what you said there. But the reason I do it is, well, I don't particularly enjoy writing. So, and if you're thinking about marketing, then you've got to do some marketing for your business. Otherwise, your business is never going to get known. So, choose something that you enjoy doing. Like you enjoy it, I enjoy it. Because the reason I enjoy it is because, firstly, I went on a podcast years ago, and then I ended up getting a client, and not in the UK, but in Australia, because I was on a podcast. I thought, well, this is interesting, and then I thought, well, I'll start my own, and then I actually realised that podcasting, it motivates me because it actually fulfills my top 3 motivators. So when you do that, then you're going to carry on doing something. But if the opposite's true, then you'll probably find a way not to do it again. So that's the key with motivation, is understanding what drives your behaviour, and actually what you get from it, and what you're actually looking to be fulfilled.
Well, because as I mentioned in the preamble, a lot of my guests, for some reason, seem to come from the States. I get all these high-flying, people, and I think, God blimey, I'm going to get 20, 25 minutes of free coaching here. So if nobody listens, I don't care. I'm going to learn a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. It's definitely a learning experience. For every person that comes on this podcast, I definitely learn something. So, and that's one of my top motivators. So there we go. Trevor, I'm conscious of the time, and sadly, we're getting towards the end of the podcast. But I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to sit back and just listen to a few things that I'm going to share. So this is the part in the show where I introduce the 7-step process, and it's relevant for pretty much any business that you're running. And it tends to start here, which is the mirror, understanding yourself, putting up the mirror, understanding what drives you, your personality, and all those sort of things. And it's very relevant to what we've been talking about here, because if you understand yourself, you realise actually what's holding you back, maybe to do those presentations, or even just maybe doing a speaking gig of some description, and you can overcome those things just by understanding yourself a bit better. It'll definitely help me. And then before we went live, you said about it being relevant with the energizing people, understanding that you've got to get a message across to other people, and energizing is about letting other people make decisions, and so a presentation is a great way to do that. And so what I wanted to do particularly here is, when we're talking about presentations, we're really talking about communications. So one of the models I use in the evaluation stage here is where evaluation is where we decide where we are and where we want to go, and then start planning how we're going to get there, is this model, which is the 5 elements tool I use. And the reason I use this is because there's 5 elements, but we're not good at all 5 steps in the process. So the way to describe this is to maybe think about if you are planning your shopping. So let's make it food shopping. Most people need to do that. And so when you think, right, we need to go shopping, there's certain things people will do because of their communication style. So some people might go, oh, right, which supermarket are we going to go to? Or somebody might say, oh, yes, but how much have we got to spend? Or somebody might say, yeah, but let's look in the cupboards and see what we really need, and see what the things that we bought last time that we didn't use. So all these things are in the mix. And so when you think about planning something, all these sort of things are going on in your head, and that actually affects the way we communicate. It's the way that we go to that point in the process. So let's just skip through the 7 steps. So first of all, you need to check where you are. Then you've got to have a vision as to where you want to go. So when we go back to the supermarket thing, then the vision is, right, we need to go to shopping, we need to get the food for the week, and by the time we've completed it, we want to have enough food in the cupboards and in the fridge and freezer to keep us going for the next week. So then the planning stage is, right, so that might be where we're going to go, and which supermarket, and also thinking about what's important to buy, and again, it comes back to what the supermarket is particularly good for. Facilitating is, well, how much have we got to spend? and realising that that has an effect on what we can afford. So if there's a budget, then we've got to make sure that we go to the supermarket that fits our budget. And then you've got to do it. Go to the supermarket and see how you get on. And you know that when you go to the supermarket, some things will be out of stock. So you've got to make a decision on the spot to change something. And that's very much about doing. And then the whole process starts again when you go to next week, when you need to do it again. So communication is interesting in that we think about it as just a conversation and we're talking about things, but actually we've got to think about what's going on in our heads at the time, and that influences how we communicate with somebody else. So there we are, Trevor. What do you think about what I've just shared there?
Well, I think there's a huge amount relevant to what we've been talking about there, Mark, because a presentation is a communication tool, and it's really important that you think about who you're communicating to, how you want to communicate, what they're expecting from you, and all the bits that come with that as well. So it's a great analogy, the supermarket. I really like that, because I think you could use that for presenting easily or doing a sales pitch or whatever it might be. So yeah, really, really great stuff.
Yeah, because I mean, it doesn't matter how many people you're communicating with. So, for instance, when I'm going shopping with my partner, she'll think about other things than what I think about. I'm thinking about the quality of the food is at the moment is important to me, whereas she might be thinking more about keeping the budget under control. So it's important to make sure everyone's on the same wavelength, and that's where communication breaks down, when people are thinking about two completely different things. Sadly, Trevor, our time is up. I'm very grateful for your time today. I've really learnt a lot, and I will continue to learn from your book and all the other things that, because I think, as you have said, it's an important way to get a message across. So thank you for your time today, and hopefully our paths will cross again very soon.
Well, of course, I've got your book, Mark. We did a book swap.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
Well,
it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's been great fun, Trevor. And yes, we'll catch up very soon. So there's Trevor, who will help you with your presentations and even maybe podcasting. If you're interested in podcasting, then reach out to Trevor, because he's got lots of experience and might be able to point you in the direction, just like Pete Matthews did when he was thinking about doing a podcast. So just before we go then, just to mention the book again, the 7-step process I've just shared, that's in there, and also the 5 elements communication tool as well, mention that in there. So you can buy that book from Amazon or from myself. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, then buy me a coffee. And as I said at the beginning, if you buy me 2 coffees, I will send you a copy of my book as a thank you. So there we are. That's another episode completed. Until the next time we meet up, or the next episode of the show, I should say, have a great day. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you very soon.